So thank you everyone for inviting us here to talk to you a bit about measles in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Our first talk is going to focus on an outbreak alert system, and then we'll go into a second one after. So let's start with a bit of context. Now, as most of you know, measles remains a substantial burden in DRC. Here, you can see the number of weekly suspected cases at the national scale, and what we see is not only seasonal outbreaks, but also major epidemics, the last one being in 2019. Now, outbreak alert systems can reduce response delays and minimize the scale of measles epidemics. And indeed, most MSF sections have some sort of system like this in place. Unfortunately, however, our analysis demonstrates that MSF is still reacting to outbreaks late. And that brings me to the primary question of this first talk. Can we identify a strong alert system that can be used consistently across the country and across the different MSF groups? Now, what do I mean when I say a strong alert system? Well, for me, I have two main goals in mind. The first is simplicity. I want the system to be easy to implement, and I want it to be easy to interpret. The second is that I want the system to be balanced. I want to identify as many outbreaks as possible, as early as possible, but I don't want to have too many false alarms either. So how do we do that? Well, today I'm going to run you through a retrospective analysis that has 3 steps. The first was to identify all health zone level outbreaks between 2015 and 2020 using surveillance data from the Ministry of Health. Then, I want to evaluate how well various alert thresholds would have performed during each of those outbreaks, and I want to choose the ones that would have performed the best. And finally, if we have time, I want to determine if those thresholds would have had similar performance across each year and throughout the country. So let's begin with step 1. Let's maybe begin with step 1. All right. So going back, here we have, once again, our weekly cases at the national level, and this is our individual cases each week. But I can break that down into individual outbreaks, again, at the health zone level. If I do that, I find this, roughly 400 outbreaks in the 5 years analyzed. Now, to give you a little idea of what those outbreaks look like, we might measure their size in terms of number of cases, where I find a median of 726. I might also ask how long they last, in which case I find a median duration of 31 weeks. So now we have our outbreaks. Let's talk about our detection systems. Well, we can have multiple different early warning systems to consider. The first could be that's used by the Ministry of Health, where we look for 5 suspected cases at the level of aire de santé. For us at MSF, this system is not possible because we do not have surveillance data available to us at that resolution. So instead, we might consider the classic system, which most sections use right now, which is to look for an increasing trend over several weeks, usually 3 or 4. Unfortunately, what we found in 2019 during that massive epidemic was that this system wasn't performing quite as well as we want it to. So today, I'm going to talk about an alternative, one that looks for minimum thresholds of suspected cases in a given health zone. Now, what exactly do I mean by that? Well, several possible systems were evaluated, each including a weekly and a tri-weekly threshold. The weekly threshold is defined as the number of suspected cases in a single week, and we considered options ranging from 1 case, 5, 10, 15, all the way up to 35. Our tri-weekly threshold is then the total number of suspected cases over 3 weeks, and here the options were 15, 20, etc., up to 45. So for example, one system could be composed of combining our weekly threshold of 20 with our tri-weekly threshold of 35. Another example would be a system with a weekly threshold of 10 and a tri-weekly threshold of 15, and so on and so forth. We consider all of the combinations. So let's put all of that together. And let's put that together with some metrics of performance. Now think back, we want again to have balanced performance. That was our second goal. And to do that, we need to evaluate both positive and negative metrics. My positive metric is going to be the number of cases captured by response. And here I use the word response deliberately because I don't know if we're going to do a vaccination campaign or case management or potentially something else. What I do know, however, is that there will be a moment when we have an alert and then there will be some amount of delay. I'm going to assume that delay is 8 weeks. And then some form of response starts. And I define the number of cases captured as all of our outbreak cases that start at that 8-week mark when the response begins up until the end of that outbreak. And because this is my positive indicator, I want it to be as high as possible. For our negative indicator, we're going to look at the frequency of false alerts. How many alerts were never followed by an outbreak at all? And because that's our negative indicator, we want to minimize it as much as possible. So putting it all together, we get a plot that looks like this. And I know it's a little bit complicated, so let's break it down. First, I want you to look at the circles. Each one represents one of those threshold combinations. So here, for example, we have our 515 case. So the first number is then our weekly threshold, 5 cases in this one. And the second number is our triweekly case threshold. So in this case, 15. On our vertical axis, we then see our positive indicators. And on the left-hand side, you have the total number of cases captured. Here, this is summed across all 5 years analyzed. And on the right-hand side, you have exactly the same indicator, but this time represented as a percentage. What proportion of all of the outbreak cases I observed in those 5 years would have been captured by that specific threshold? On the horizontal axis, we then see our negative indicator, false alerts, once again, in this case, totaled across all 5 years analyzed. Now, as a bit of motivation for this alternative system, I want to show you what it would have looked like if we had held on to our system using triweekly trend. Now, notice here, I've actually had to expand the axis just to show you how it would have performed. And what we see is that our alternative wildly outperforms the system being used now. We also considered an option that used only the weekly threshold and ignored the triweekly threshold, because again, we want things to be as simple as possible. And while that does indeed perform better than using trend over 3 weeks, it's still not performing quite as well as our combination system. And that's probably because using both a weekly and triweekly threshold is better able to capture outbreaks that start with spikes and those that start more gradually. So let's hold on just to those systems that combine the 2 thresholds. And here I want to add a plot on the right that has a slightly different version of our negative indicator, false alerts. This time, it is false alert risk. What is the probability that a given alert is false? Now, as you can see, we have a lot of options there, but I want to highlight 2 in particular. The first is 2035, and I choose that because it has balanced performance. The second is 1015, which I choose because it is the point of diminishing returns, which is to say, if I keep moving towards more and more sensitive systems, I might capture a few more cases, but it starts to come at a truly substantial cost of additional false alerts. Now, what do those look like in terms of numbers? Well, what I find is that my more sensitive system would have captured 413,000 cases, or 85%, at a cost of 863 false alerts. By comparison, our balanced system would have captured 372 cases, or 76%, with a cost of 301 false alerts. Translating that into false alert risk, our sensitive system has a false alert risk of 68% compared to 43% for the more balanced system. Now that's great, but in the minutes that I have remaining for me, I want to try to look a little bit deeper. So we might ask, for example, what does that look like in time? So here in yellow, you can see our more sensitive system, and in blue, the one that is more balanced. And in the first plot, we have cases captured, this time represented only as the percentage, on all 5 years analyzed from 2015 until 2020. Now, what I really care about here is, did it perform equally well on our major epidemic years and on our smaller seasonal outbreak years? So just to remind us, in the background here, we can see the number of outbreaks on each of those years. And what we see is that there is some variability, but it's not that substantial. And certainly our major outbreak year falls very much in the middle of the performance. And what we find is that in general, our sensitive system captured 10% more cases than the more balanced one. But of course, that comes at a cost. And the cost we see is an increase of 25% in false alert risk. Now here I want to add just one more indicator, which isn't per se good or bad, but rather one about logistic burden. And that is the number of concurrent alerts we would see in 1 month. And what we find is that our sensitive system creates about twice as many alerts compared to the more balanced one. Now that's great in terms of heterogeneity with respect to time, but what about with respect to space? So here, we're looking at risk profiles, and that's something that comes out of a collaboration we've done with Penn State. Birgit's going to talk to you a little bit more about that. All you need to know right now is that we created a system to identify certain health zones as high priority. And what I find is that in terms of cases captured, I do get a modest improvement in those high priority zones. But what's more interesting is the figure on the right, where indeed I see that both systems were more reliable in high priority zones, wherein the risk of an alert being false was approximately half that of the rest of the country. So to quickly conclude, before I hand it off to Birgit, today we identified 2 possible alert systems, 1015 and 2035, that could be used to improve response time for measles outbreaks in DRC. We found that while our more sensitive system, 1015, captured 10% more cases than 2035, it came at a cost of 25% higher risk of false alerts. Now, that being said, false alert risk was cut in half in high priority zones, suggesting that a more sensitive system could be used in those areas. And finally, ongoing work is being done to decide how to best implement these thresholds in DRC and whether they can be applied in other settings. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Birgit, who will talk about a practical application with the URGEPI project.
Yeah, great. Thanks. So in the next couple of minutes, I'm going to describe to you a measles emergency project where we implemented 2 different alert thresholds according to epidemic risk. So first, to give you a bit of context, the URGEPI project has been initiated by MSF France in 2018, and it aims to improve how we prevent and respond to measles epidemics in general. It is located in the 4 provinces of the Grand Katanga region in the DRC. The project strategy is based on a risk-targeted approach, so more resources are allocated towards areas that are at higher risk of large measles epidemics. And activities include prevention, surveillance, biological confirmation of epidemics, interventions including vaccination and case management, as well as operational research. The surveillance strategy of URGEPI is based on the national surveillance system, where suspected measles cases are notified by health zones on a weekly basis. Our surveillance covers all 68 health zones in the 4 provinces. However, we chose 20 high-risk health zones for supplementary actions. All 68 health zones are also considered for interventions. However, in the high-risk health zones, we try to be faster and more efficient. So to detect alerts early in time in these high-risk health zones, we opted for the more sensitive threshold, as described in the analysis of Catherine, with 10 cases per week or 15 cumulative cases in 3 weeks, but also because in this area we have more access or faster access to laboratory confirmation due to MSF support. We also allowed an alert to be triggered by a single confirmed case. In the remaining 48 regular health zones, we chose a less sensitive alert threshold, the 20 suspected cases per week, or 35 cases in 3 weeks, or 3 confirmed cases. In addition, in the high-risk health zones, we are also in regular contact with the Ministry of Health to gather additional data in real time, and we may also provide technical or financial support for alert investigations or biological confirmation. Now, as you've heard before, it is really important that we identify alerts early in time because the steps from alert notification to the final intervention cause significant delays. And indeed, in the URGEPI project, we observed in 2021 that it takes a median of 11 days from alert notification to an investigation of an alert, a median of 49 days to a final decision to intervene or not, and it may even take a median of 62 or 67 days until a case management or vaccination campaign is started. Now, to see whether the early detection of alerts allowed us to intervene in time, we compare the timing of these different actions to the progression of the epidemic, here using the first week when 20 cases were notified in a health zone as a reference. So you can see that all actions that took place in the lower half of the graph, they happened before 20 cases were notified for the first time. All action that took part in the upper half of the graph happened after 20 cases were notified and the epidemic had already progressed. So here in blue in the regular health zones, you can see that while alerts have been triggered around the time where 20 cases were notified, The decision to intervene was made about a month after 20 cases were notified for the first time, and the intervention started even around 2 months later. In the high-risk health zone, even though the implementation delays were not shorter than in the regular health zones, the early detection of an alert allowed us to stay ahead in time, so that intervention started about at the moment where 20 cases had been notified for the first time. So in conclusion, the lower alert threshold in the high-risk zones allowed us to intervene ahead of substantial epidemic progression, while interventions took place later in the other regular health zones. And even though the lower alert threshold is more suitable to detect epidemics in time, it is difficult to implement it on a large geographic scale due to the higher risk of false alerts. Nevertheless, the WGEPI experience showed that it is very operationally feasible to implement 2 different alert thresholds according to epidemic risk. So there were no operational constraints, no confusion within the project or in the collaboration with the Ministry of Health. Just in the end, it is also noteworthy that a large proportion of our alerts were triggered by the confirmed case component. So this has not yet been evaluated, and it may also vary substantially in space and time depending on lab capacities. And moving forward, it will also be interesting to evaluate how the rapid diagnostic tests for that are currently being developed for measles could be integrated in an alert system. So finally, I would like to thank Etienne and Nicolas for their participation in the discussions about alert thresholds, and of course, all the epidemiologists working in DRC and the WGEPI team. And thank you very much for your attention.